folks, welcome back to World War II TV, and over the years we have tackled many of World War II's most audacious and risky airborne operations, and also looked at various other... Hang on. You've got your screen open, Bruce. You've got YouTube open somewhere else. I have. Tackled many of World War II's most audacious and risky things happening in the back. There's a double audio here somewhere. I'll just mute you for a second, Bruce. I think you've got your YouTube page open. So anyway, here we are. We're talking with my guest, Dr. Bruce Tocher, who is talking about the research he has spent over the last few years looking at Operation Freshman and the engineers who tragically were involved in the mission, and many of whom didn't make it back home. I'm delighted he's joining us now. I'll bring him in. Good evening, sir. How are you?
I'm good, thanks, Paul. Good to see you.
Good. Yeah, we had a bit of an echo thing going on there. Anyway, so
my fault.
We were just talking about Remembrance in Norway and museum projects, and Operation Freshman, compared to some of the very, very big, very famous airborne operations, it's not as well known. So how did you come across it yourself?
Well, I've always had a fascination for military history, especially World War II, and when I moved to Norway more than 30 years ago, I kind of got into the British-Norwegian connection, of which, as you've seen on your show many times, there is a very, very strong connection. And I got to know some of the local people who knew something about it. They knew a lot of the local stuff that was going on, and also visit to the cemeteries. When you visit the cemeteries, the Commonwealth graves, and every time you visit a Commonwealth grave, it just has a story. And the one in Stavanger is a classic because you have this large group of men from the Royal Engineers, all with the same date of death. And that tells you that it's not just a plane crash. Usually it's something bigger. So that's really what spiked my interest. Yeah.
And the other question I'll ask you is, and I've asked some of the other Norwegian historians, is how you set about kind of separating the various elements of this story. Because as soon as you get a mix of airborne, SOE, resistance, Air Force, it's like the spider's web of research. You know, you could just get stuck for years and years. I mean, obviously we're focusing on the Royal Engineers, but it gets these sorts of operations, especially at that time of the war, they do get a bit loose because so many organizations end up having a bit of a hand in. How do you kind of, get on with that aspect of it?
Well, who says I'm getting the hand on it? It has been, it has been a few years, but you're absolutely right. I guess, there's been some good research done previously. The National Archives is just outstanding, one of my favorite places at Kew. The Norwegian archives are also fantastic. Speaking and reading Norwegian makes a huge difference. I can interact with people in the local museums and local historians, and also local people. And but where I started the whole thing was really with tracing the families.
Right.
A friend of mine, Ian Drew, who wrote a book on silent heroes, he traced several of the families of the Royal Engineers and aircrew and glider pilots, and so I basically tried to build on that and trace the families, and that's really where it got going. Because once I started to find them, which is much easier now because of genealogy databases and the internet, so it is in Facebook, it's easier to find people. I still haven't found them all, but I have found a lot. And
well, if you'd found them all, you'd then have no need to keep on researching it, would you? It's like finding that last baseball card. You have no purpose in life. So well, anyway, we'll bring up the slides then, folks. What we'll do is the majority of questions at the end of the show today, unless there's anything particular relating to something that's on the slide, but the majority kind of big ones about Remembrance in Norway. We'll do that later. I'm going to hand over to my guest Bruce to take us through this tragic but ultimately very rewarding story.
Thank you, Paul. So Operation Freshman, as some of you will know, was the Allies' first glider-borne raid of World War II. The mission was to attack the heavy water cellar in Vemork in Norway. And but what most people don't know, and a lot of people who know about Vemork and a lot of Norwegians I talked to, they're very familiar with Gunnerside, the success story, if you like. But Freshman is something that's not as well known. And yet a lot of Norwegians were involved in the planning of Freshman and also became very involved in the aftermath when the aircraft came down, which I'll talk about a little bit later. But the first thing to remember is that Freshman was the first of 4 actions, which were connected to what we call the Heavy Water War in Norway. The year afterwards, you had Operation Gunnerside, which obviously was a great success and launched Hollywood into stardom, the heroes of Telemark. But there's also the American bombing of the Vemork and Rjukan, which occurred afterwards, and finally the sinking of the ferry in Tocher, which held the remnants of the heavy water stocks from Vemork. So there were 4 actions, and why Vemork and why what was heavy water? I could spend a week just talking about that, and I'm definitely not going to do it. I'm no chemist or physicist, and there's a lot of words up there, and you can read them at your leisure afterwards. But I put them up there as just kind of talking points. It's as I say, there could be pages and pages and pages of similar type of things. But essentially, Vemork became an industrialized area in the early 1900s. It's the valley there is a big, deep one with steep mountainsides with huge waterfalls, so it's ideal for hydroelectric power. And a Norwegian engineer and industrialist and entrepreneur, Sam Eide, he recognized this in the early 1900s, and he acquired with outside investors. He acquired a lot of this area with an idea to develop it for industrial purposes, without at the time actually knowing what he was going to do. But shortly afterwards, he also came in contact with a Norwegian scientist, Christian Birkeland, and they got into discussion about artificial fertilizers. Because of increasing populations worldwide, but particularly in Europe and America and other places, the need for increased food production was becoming increasingly important. And there were a lot of agricultural advances at the time, but they knew that the value of fertilizers, of nitrates, but most of these were sourced from natural deposits and saltpeter deposits in Chile and from guano deposits on islands. But those are kind of those are limited in limited resources. They will run out, and so trying to find an artificial source of nitrates was really big. And this is where the Vemork story really got going. Either he founded what would later become the Norsk Hydro company, and the Vemork hydroelectric plant was completed in 1911. The process they used, actually, just as a side, and I often do go off on sides here, the nitrates that they produced, they were essentially for fertilizer, but of course the First World War popped up. And Norsk Hydro at the time had both French and German ownership, part ownership. And so there was a real balancing act for the management of Norsk Hydro, how much nitrates they supplied to each country for armaments. And France won pretty much hands down on that one, but Germany didn't lose out entirely. And I guess it was a good earner for the company during those years. The process they used was fairly inefficient in terms of the power usage, and so eventually, after the war in the 20s, they came up with another method of producing ammonia, and based on water hydrolysis, and so they built a new factory at Vemork in front of the old power station. So you see the power station and the waterfalls down on the bottom left, but in the top right, you can see the new factory, the hydrogen factory, essentially, or water hydrolysis factory. It was established. It's about 8 stories, I think. It's reinforced concrete. It's a very strong building, and it was packed with catalytic equipment. So Jomar Brun, in 1929, when the factory opened, Jomar Brun, who's somebody that we come across later in the story, is an important part of this. He was the manager of the hydrogen factory at Vemork. And then we move into the physics and chemistry. In 1931, deuterium, which is heavy hydrogen, is discovered in the United States, Harald Urey. And the following year, his mentor discovered deuterium oxide, which is a form of water which has the heavy hydrogen deuterium atom instead of the normal hydrogen atom. So it has slightly different properties, and it was seen that it could have uses for medical purposes and for other purposes. And Jomar Brun and Leif Tronstad, at the time Professor Leif Tronstad, who many people will have heard about, and who is also an important person in the story, they submitted a proposal to Norsk Hydro for the commercial production of heavy water in the early 1930s. And in 1934, it was agreed to do this. And so they enlarged the heavy water facility in 1935. And then in 1939, you had the discovery of nuclear fission by German scientists and Austrian Germans. And then in 1940, IG Farben, the German partner for Norsk Hydro, they sent a request to the company offering to buy all available stocks of heavy water. This was a concern because Hydro asked why, and they refused to tell them. But they did inform, with a visit to France, they did inform the French investors, which was BNP Bank, and French intelligence became aware of it, and they sent a couple of their agents over to Vemork, and with a lot of money, and offered to buy all the stocks. The director of the company, when he understood what the potential usage could be, he gave them all the stocks, and they were smuggled out of the country. It's a fantastic story, but too long to talk about here. Smuggled the heavy water out to France via Scotland, and down to London, and over to France, and then he came back again once the Germans invaded. 1940, the German invasion of Norway, massive increase of production in heavy water requested, and that information came to British intelligence, and ultimately they decided to do something about that. So I like timelines. Timelines are to me are the way that you hang all this information on.
Yep.
And there was actually a plan already to attack industrial facilities in Norway. The Norwegians had supplied an extensive overview of Norwegian industry to the British. And there was an operation that SOE came up with, Operation Clairvoyant, which was the concept was that they'd have multiple teams attacking simultaneously different industrial plants in Norway. That operation, there was one sub-action that actually came about, but Operation Clairvoyant otherwise wasn't followed through. But interestingly, as part of that, the Vemork plant was in there, not so much necessarily for the heavy water, more as a power station and a source of nitrates. But it was considered in Clairvoyant that it would be bombed. And as we'll talk about afterwards, when bombing was an option for freshmen, the Norwegian authorities were very against it because of various reasons. But Clairvoyant, they were going to bomb the factory at Vemork.
Just a quick question for you, Bruce. You said that about the information getting out of Norway. As I understand, we did the show about the Shetland bus operations a couple of weeks ago. That was what Norway was arguably one of the countries where the Britain was getting the most information from because of all those fields and harbors and ports and Narvik in 1940. There seems to me there was sort of a steady stream of information coming on a fairly organized basis.
Yeah, I think most of the information, a lot of information came via that, but a lot went via Sweden. Right. The legation in Sweden. They supplied a lot of information to British intelligence there, and that was taken straight back to the UK. So there was a real organised system of couriers taking information all the time to Sweden on the land route, and then it being taken to UK. So we get to 1942, and 8th of September, a raid is proposed, as a combined operations raid, the Chief of Staff Committee, and you had Mountbatten, who was the chief of combined operations at the time, and he presented these proposals over and over again. I often say to people that when you read these documents, it reminds me of my time in the oil industry when you're presenting to the chief executive committee, and you get asked a lot of questions, and you're told to come back the next week with another iteration. Very, very like that, and it is fascinating reading the minutes of the Chiefs of Staff committee meetings that they held every week. So Mountbatten presented this in 8th September 42, and it wasn't until October that you had the first meeting between the Combined Operations Headquarters, the Airborne Division, and the RAF senior leadership. And then already we're into 18th of October, and the Grouse party is parachuted into Norway. Grouse was repurposed, essentially. It had been planned to go to Norway and had a list of tasks that it was supposed to do, organize local resistance groups and so on and so forth. But they were repurposed for freshmen to take part in freshmen afterwards. 19th of October, you had Lieutenant Colonel Henneker turning up at Bilford Barracks, asking for volunteers for a special mission. I couldn't tell them what it was. Said it was extremely dangerous, and he had a group of men already pre-selected to consider this option. And as far as I understand, everybody in the room decided to stay. But that happened on the 19th of October in the old cinema at Bilford. It wasn't until October, almost a week afterwards, that the final decision was made to use gliders. All the time they had been thinking they might use paratroopers, but on the 24th of October, they finally decided to use gliders. Same day, the RAF air crews and glider pilots were selected. And then on the 19th of November, Operation Freshman was launched. So you can see that timetable from first concept presenting to the Chiefs of Staff in September, and then in November, your go. So that time frame is super compressed for how complex the mission it was. Just to set the scene a little bit for where we're talking about, even though the freshman guys didn't reach here, but you can see the idea was that they would land near a lake up on the Hardanger Plateau, up to the north there, and then they would walk all the way down to the factory at Vemork. And having completed the demolitions, they would then split into groups of 2s and 3s and make their way on foot to Sweden. But I just wanted to show this kind of terrain map so you get an idea of what it looks like. It was winter, but not full winter. There was snow, but it wasn't the deep snow you would get in December, January. But there would have been snow, but it's a big area. It's a big, difficult area to get around in. So the attack options that were considered were, as I say, bombing. Bombing was ruled out fairly quickly. Bomber Command was under a lot of pressure. The idea of them releasing a lot of bombers to attack such a tricky target without actually understanding what it was they were bombing, that was not that was rejected fairly quickly. In addition, it's a really narrow, deep valley. There were anti-aircraft wires stretched across it, so you wouldn't be able to come in low. And the target is so small. I showed you that factory, which is a big factory, but the actual target, the heavy water cellar, is tiny compared to that, and it's underneath all these layers of reinforced concrete. So it would be a tough bombing target. Not that it stopped the Americans later, but it's a tough target. Internal sabotage. There was actually internal sabotage going on. Jomar Brun and also one of the engineers, they were adding cod liver oil or whatever into the mix to lower the quality and purity of the heavy water. So they were doing things like that, but it's not sustainable. They would have been caught ultimately. The consequences would have been severe for everybody. The Germans had shown that they could be completely ruthless if there was any attempt at sabotage. So although it was going on, it was not seen as sustainable. SOE were also considered, but SOE themselves, having looked at the documents, I always thought they were kind of put down and said, no, you're not ready for this. But when I see the actual documents prior to this, they seem to accept that it needed a bigger scale operation that combined operations could perhaps provide. So they weren't really ruled out of it, and they were totally involved in the planning and execution afterwards. So combined operations was picked, and then you had the various discussions on insertion extraction, and I'll come back to why so many troops were needed a little bit later. But insertion extraction options were Catalina flying boats landing on one of the lakes on the Hardanger Plateau, come out, walk down to the factory, and do the demolitions, and then come back up, get in the Catalina flying boat, and be back home for your bacon, eggs, and the breakfast. But Catalina flying boats were extremely rare, extremely valuable, needed for anti-submarine patrols and coastal command. Plus, you would have to have them on standby for quite a long time to get the right weather conditions, and nobody could foresee that you could really do that. Another risk was that the raid was picked for November. You get ice on the lakes, not necessarily completely covering it, but you will get ice. And if you'd landed and hit some ice, you could have destroyed a very valuable piece of kit. So that was ruled out. So then it was parachute or glider. Parachute, it is Norway. It is November. You have 30 men to get out there with all their equipment and explosives and the means to get from Vemork once they've done the task and walk to Sweden. So you're going to need a lot of stuff. You've got to get all these guys out on a night drop and get them together and all their kit together, and then attack the factory on the same night. It's not going to happen. It's going to be super tough. You're going to have injuries. You're going to have dispersal. The gunner side team and the gunner side and Grouse teams had the same issues. It took them days to find some of their containers. So that was also ruled out, and eventually they went for the gliders. Then how do you get the guys out once they've done their task? Well, you pick up by submarine was one thing, but again, you've got 30 people making their way independently to a point. So how long do you have a submarine hanging around waiting for dribs and drabs to appear? Pretty tough. And walking overland to Sweden was the eventual one that was decided on. But surrender was also brought up in one of the documents, and that surprised me, that it was actually commented, but at no point agreed on, but it was commented. In view of the importance of the objective, this last resort might not be unacceptable. So this is how highly they regarded the target.
Yeah. Wow.
Not knowing about the Kommandobefehl, of course. That's really,
I was saying, it's about that time, isn't it? Although the information will be taken a while to filter its way across the Third Reich, I guess.
Indeed.
But yeah.
Indeed.
Wow.
So you now go into once you've decided on the raid, you've got a time frame. You're aiming for a moon period in November. So then you go into the heavy part of planning, intelligence gathering, combined operations. Have their military raid planners working on this full time. Special operations executive have people in Norway, and also they have people at the embassy and the legation in Sweden. And you have Norwegian resistance and people within the factory who are supplying information and transmitting this about troop movements, about the facilities, and so on. I just put up two guys here who were very important. Einar Skinnerland, who played a very significant role afterwards with Grouse and the other actions on the bottom left, and Jomar Brun, who was the manager of the hydrogen factory. He was actually brought out of Norway just before freshman. The freshman guys didn't meet him, but the leadership did, and he was there to answer detailed questions. He also brought some very detailed sketches of the facility, which were used both by freshmen and by gunner side. And finally, photographic reconnaissance. This is also was extremely important. There had been some missions run already, just mapping out or photographing industrial facilities in Norway, and I'll come back to that one again. But that was also extremely important. That's the factory you're seeing in that photograph there, and you can see this tiny little line here, which is the bridge they would all have to cross to get to it. So, photo reconnaissance, as I said, there is a story there which I only relatively recently found out about. I was aware that Lieutenant Colonel Henniker was anxious to get a photograph of the proposed landing site for the gliders. And in one of the archive documents, it states that a mission had been attempted, but the aircraft hadn't returned. And it turns out that in fact the aircraft was from Luchers. It was PRU Mosquito from Luchers, and the pilot, Flight Lieutenant Donald Hickson, he was the guy who took the earlier photographs, and possibly. John Douglas Hayes was also on that flight, but in the squadron records, it only lists the pilot in this particular case. But the photographs that were taken earlier by Hickson were the ones that were used by Freshman and by Gunnerside and by the U.S. Army Air Force later.
Wow, yeah.
So it was a really important story. But they took off on 17th of October and 9:30, and their job was to photograph the glider landing site. Sadly, that didn't happen, or maybe they did. We don't know. But their aircraft was intercepted near Oslo. They may have had a secondary target they were going for. We don't quite know, but they were shot down near a place called Undrumsdal, west of Oslo. And I gave a talk there earlier this year at that place, to the local Norwegian society, and they brought out this piece of the mosquito that one of the locals had found. That's me holding it in that picture up there.
Incredible, yeah.
But one guy remembered it. He was a kid and he remembered the crash, so that was quite something. But that photographic reconnaissance, that part failed, unfortunately. But the other ones they took were really, really useful. The day after that mission, the Grouse Team were flown in, and again, it's an entire story talking about their trials and tribulations of when they landed and getting to their base camp for freshmen, and also beyond that when they joined the Gunnerside team. But their main job was to do a reconnaissance of the landing ground, find a good place for gliders, and make sure it was suitable, and gather intelligence about troop movements, and also get some information from the local resistance. They would then mark the landing area with landing lights on night when they had the correct signal. They would also maintain the radio equipment and operation of the Eureka target guidance equipment, which I'll come back to. Their job on the night, once the gliders had landed, was to provide guides to lead them to the target, but they were not to take part. And that was very, very specific. They had other tasks after this, so they were to take the men there, but that was it. They would then go back to their base camp. So the Washington Party, where does Washington come from? Well, the code name for freshmen was the Washington Cup, or the Washington competition. Nobody talked about freshmen, and even the people who trained with them and were with them right up until they left, they still referred to, even years afterward, as the Washington Cup, not freshmen. So the people involved, as I said, the SOE Advanced Party of Grouse, the 4 of them. You had 30 Royal Engineers from the Airborne Division, 20 from 9 Field Company, and 10 from 261st Field Park Company. And they all volunteered for that mission. You had 14 air crews selected from RAF Army Cooperation Command, and you had 4 glider pilots, 2 from the Glider Pilot Regiment and 2 from the Royal Australian Air Force. Big question was why Australian pilots, and it turns out that they specifically requested to go. They had been involved in some of the training with the for the mission, the actual glider training and logistics, and they asked to go and were given permission. They were excellent pilots, were fully qualified aircraft pilots as well. So, training. I've given this talk to quite a few military, army groups, and they recognize a lot of this kind of stuff. And it is very much they had the meeting in Bilford Barracks, and then 2 days afterwards they were doing the hardening up and getting physically fit, and a lot of route marches and that kind of thing. Then they went for several days to Wales, did some mountaineering, map reading, survival training. They were living on particular rations. They were not allowed to get food from anywhere else. They were sleeping rough and trying to, as I said, a lot of map reading stuff. They did about a day and a half specialist training in demolitions and silent killing techniques at the at SDS-17. When one of them was into, one of the people that didn't eventually got injured, and when he was asked years afterwards how long they spent there, and he seemed to think it was quite a long time, but when you look at their schedule, it was only a full day and a half, so it was pretty short. They went on the range, the usual shooting range, and they also were shown how to do the dagger stabbing training, the silent killing techniques, but they weren't there for very long. I think that's fair to say.
Just sorry to interrupt. It was from the beginning. It was always going to be engineers with commando training, as opposed to commandos with engineer training. I'm thinking of the crappy Armageddon film with Bruce Willis, where they send the miners up to knock out the meteor. People say, why didn't they train astronauts to be miners rather than miners as astronauts? I mean, in this case, what was there an early call on this needs to be engineers?
It's partly who was available at the time, because the more trained parachute troops were already assigned to North Africa. They were assigned for that, and I didn't mention, but I should have done that. That several of the Ninefield Company, for example, they were quite experienced. They had come through. They served with the British Expeditionary Force. They had come through Dunkirk, so they were combat trained. The rest weren't. Right. That's fair to say. But the actual demolitions was very much. I think they felt that engineers would fit the bill. But you're right. It was very limited specialist training they had time for to do this, and no winter training at all, which is another thing. There was talk about using ski troops. We just didn't have ski troops. Officers used to go skiing before the war, but not so many other people. So you didn't have ski troops. So they ended up choosing the people who were assigned to the Airborne Division, some who had experience and some who had technical skills that they thought would fit. They'd also all done parachute training and at least up to the basic parachute training, not full paratrooper training, all of them, and glider training. And that was also a factor. They'd all done glider training, which was when they decided to use gliders, they fitted the bill.
Okay, thank you.
So they also visited some facilities in the UK to have a look at what machines would look like, and they visited the salt factory at Lever Brothers in Liverpool, hydroelectric plant near Fort William. Great story about this 60, 70-year-old Scottish guy from the hydroelectric plant dragging them up a hill and running much faster than they could. So it's a nice story. And then they were given a short leave, and I put a picture of Sapper Bonner there with his wife to kind of remind us what that would have been like. Not everybody was able to go and visit their wives, but they were given 48 hours leave. So depending on where you were and where your family was, you might be able to see them, you might not. They were sworn to silence. Obviously, they're not supposed to say anything. But from what came out afterwards, it's clear that if they went down and had a couple of beers with their best friends in the pub, one or two of them said, "Look, we're about to do something, and I don't think there's any chance of us coming back from this." So there was a kind of fatality with at least some of them. Others said absolutely nothing. Just said they were off on a jaunt, and we'll see you later. But,
and presumably, Bruce, they knew very little about the actual heavy water potential of nuclear. That would have been beyond the possibility of trying to explain it. Just it's a secret thing. You've got to do it. That's it. It's machinery.
Absolutely. They weren't even told what heavy water was. There was a code name Lurgan that was given to heavy water. So the term heavy water was never even used. Right. One guy who didn't go, who was injured just near the end, he talked about. He was told that it was incredibly valuable. The Lurgan was incredibly valuable, and if you could bring some back, he might get a medal. So they knew it was important, but they were focused really on the machinery, I think. And
thank you.
That was the job. Demolish that. So they had to leave, return to Bulford, and there they did their snowshoe training. This is absolutely true. They had a commando who took them out in the thick grass and allowed them to tramp around in snowshoes for a few hours just to get the feel of what a snowshoe was like. They were actually talking about taking bicycles, fold-out bicycles on the glider, but the Grouse Team said there's too much snow, so don't bring the bikes. But they did take snowshoes. Collect their operational kit, and then 14th of November, they were on a long trip up to Wick. They arrived at RAF Skitton on the 16th. So 29 days training, but a considerable amount of time traveling between these different locations. Equipment. I have some good friends who do the collect equipment and do the military shows and so on. And thanks to them for these photographs. But they compiled the freshman kit list, if you like, and this is what we're seeing here. And anybody who's had any military training will recognize a lot of this stuff. You have weapons, you have ammunition. Of course, not every soldier had this amount of kit, but it gives you a good idea of the type of stuff they're taking. They had snow, they had the snow top, snow trousers, and down in the bottom left there, you see something dark there, but you might not know what it is, and it's actually blue woolen sweater and blue woolen ski trousers, and that was their escape disguise. When they finished the job and were making their way to Sweden, when they felt that the time was right, they were to dump their weapons and don their disguise kit, which 30 guys in blue jumpers and blue trousers. That's what all Norwegians look like. But that was the actual that was the escape clothes, if you like. Wasn't used again, and quite a few. It caused a lot of trouble internally in the UK afterwards, legally. But that was their kit.
Yeah, just a quick question on that. Gary wanted to know about the idea of them having long hair and beards to assist with the Norwegian disguise.
Yeah, so they were allowed to grow their hair. They weren't supposed to have moustaches, and so there was talk about beards and so on, but it appears that most were clean shaven. They were allowed to grow their hair so that it didn't look like it was military hair.
Right, okay.
We know for a fact that Staff Sergeant Strathdee, one of the glider pilots, certainly didn't shave his moustache off, because when they found his body after the war, it still had, that's the way they could recognize him. But yes, they did allow their hair to grow, and also while that came up, they also removed all their unit badges, so they had no airborne insignia on their uniforms. They had some Royal Engineer insignia, but they'd taken off all the airborne stuff, so they didn't have that on them either, which again was something the Germans used in trials afterwards. For the RAF tug crews, the mission required 2 Halifax bombers plus 1 spare. They had horrendous problems getting hold of 3 Halifax aircraft. Bomber Command, as I say, was under a lot of pressure. They didn't want to give up aircraft like this. And so eventually, after much high-end pressure, they got 1 good Halifax that was new, 1 that was completely stripped of all its equipment, and 1 that was pretty well worn. And so there was continuous serviceability issues. And that took up a lot of their time. In addition, the 2 crews that were selected had flown Whitleys, and they had to convert to flying a Halifax for this mission. So Halifax crews, the Bomber Command wouldn't release any, and so they had to take Army Cooperation Command and train up 2 Whitley crews. And they also had additional people added in, extra navigators and flight engineers and so on. The navigators were given specialist training with a Rebecca Eureka guidance system, fairly new. And we'll talk a bit more about that afterwards. And on the 15th, Combination A flew from Waddington to Peterhead, and they had planned to fly up to Skitton that day, but the weather was terrible in Skitton, so they got stuck in Peterhead for 2 nights. Combination B, it flew up from Netheravon, reached Peterhead the next day. They also had to sit and wait. So they had these 2 two Halifaxes and a spare aircraft sitting there at Peterhead, which nobody wanted from security purposes at all. And they didn't reach Skitten until the 17th. Group Captain Cooper was so worried by the state of one of the Halifaxes that he took the spare aircraft they had with him, which was an Albemarle, and flew back down south to pick up the third Halifax. He had left instructions for at least one Halifax to do a reconnaissance mission over the target zone that night, and then he left to pick up the spare Halifax. He got stuck because of the weather, had to take the train and then a car eventually to pick up the Halifax, flew it straight back up. And when he got back the next day, they hadn't run the mission because they were having problems with serviceability. And so he was clearly frustrated and probably extremely stressed about that. But on the 18th, two Halifaxes did make a flight over Norway, over the target area, very specific flight paths, so they didn't fly right over it, but they flew nearby, trying to use some of the landmarks. They didn't use the Rebecca Eureka system, only standard navigation. One aircraft had to turn back halfway across the North Sea. It turns out that the flight engineer that should have been there was ill, and they brought in somebody who had never done the job before. And according to both Henniker and the official report, there was quite a fruity exchange between the pilot, Squadron Leader Wilkinson, and the flight engineer, with a few expletives. And then one of the engines cut out, and they had to turn around and head back. And they just made it back. The other one, it succeeded, dropped its leaflets over Oslo. And the navigator, Flight Lieutenant Thomas, said that he, given those conditions, he felt that they could recreate that and find the target. 50 hours training specified, but less than half that were actually achieved because of serviceability, weather, and so on and so forth. And the glider pilots, so their job was, a lot of the tugging was carried out using Whitleys because of the Halifax issue. They did night towing, blind flying aids, jettisoning the undercarriage, landing on these minimal flare paths. They did 44 hours, 20 minutes, all training stages complete successfully. So their part went like a dream, and they were highly commended, all four of them, for carrying this out. So here are the families. I always like to show the photographs of the people who took part, and I thought I'd slip this one in since we have a military audience tonight and people that are really interested in this kind of thing. They might be able to help me with, who knows, with tracing some of my missing. I have photographs from almost everybody that took part, but I'm still missing family contacts for some of these, and so I have about 39 of the 48 families already contacts.
Brilliant.
So, final preparations. You had last-minute personnel changes. So, Lieutenant Green, who was to lead one of the glider parties, he had a serious injury only days before the mission took off. So, they had to bring in Lieutenant David Mefflin down in the bottom left here, 21-year-old George Medal winner already for rescuing people from a minefield in north of England. But he was brought in at the very last minute, and his family have allowed me to look at his notebook, which is beside his picture. And this notebook is absolutely fascinating. It's a tiny little thing. It's actually a 1943 diary, Royal Engineers diary, and here is the list of the kit that presumably Lieutenant Allen, who was in charge of the ground operation, or Major Chivers, but they were telling him what kit he had to draw from the stores to take part in this mission, and that's his kit list there, and it's just fascinating. And these underlined socks. So if you're a soldier, you'll know all about that, socks and smokes and that type of stuff.
Yeah.
The nickeling, the change to the operational objectives. This is quite important. So the original operational objective was to destroy the power plant, all the generators, all 10, and the heavy water cellar, all the concentration equipment in the heavy water cellar. That was the original plan. The Norwegians asked very strongly if they could leave 2 of the electrical generators operating for the local population and also to keep some nitrate fertilizer supply going. And that was agreed to. Lieutenant Colonel Henniker didn't like it, but he did agree to it. The Norwegians actually sent an officer down from the Shetland base on the 18th to hand over that request in writing again, just to try and emphasize the point. And there's a fascinating report from him about that. The nickeling flight, I've already told you about, and then you have the last wills and letters. And pretty much all the soldiers and glider pilots would definitely have written letters to their families or to their loved ones, their wives and girlfriends and so on. And obviously air crew, they usually had letters sitting waiting in case they didn't come back, but for the soldiers and glider pilots, they would all almost certainly written these letters. Right. And you know, it's so heartbreaking when you read these. I've seen quite a few now, and they're all pretty much the same, but they're trying to be encouraging and telling people not to worry. But the more you tell people not to worry, you know, the more they're going to worry, and saying you won't hear from me for a while, so don't worry about that. And I'm hoping to be back by Christmas, and you know, keep your chin up and so on. But it's incredibly poignant to read these letters. So the operation orders destroy the stocks of Lurgan, which is the code name for heavy water. The force will leave Skitten Airfield anytime between the 18th to 26th. The gliders will arrive about 8 o'clock after 3 to 3.5 hours. So you are flying at height. You are flying at night in November. It's going to be cold. The gliders are not insulated, as you know, and you're going to be bumping around quite a bit for 3.5 hours. With all this kit on, plus the concerns about what you're about to do, you're flying over the ocean, so that would not have been a comfortable 3.5 hours. The agents the Grouse Team would meet them, guide them to the objective. Then the approach march is going to take 5 to 6 hours. So everybody lands successfully, and in one piece, they have to walk for 5 to 6 hours through snow and then down the road. It's a long way to the Vemork plant. Then you have to cross that narrow bridge, which is guarded at both ends, and make your way into the facility. One group will take the generators. One group will take the heavy water cellar. You have to round up the night shift of Norwegian workers, and at all time, hopefully avoid contact with the German group who are stationed there. You're not going to be able to do that. There are just too many loose threads there. You have a lot of Norwegian workers who would be extremely concerned what was going on and might make a run for it. You had the 2 guard posts at the bridge, so it's likely you would have engaged with the enemy. It wasn't a big garrison there, but the alert probably would have gone. You had about 20 minutes to do the demolitions, and then split in your groups of 2s and 3s and head for Sweden. I can almost hear Lieutenant Colonel Henneker saying, whatever happens, someone must arrive at the objective to do the job. Detection is no excuse for halting. So they were given pretty clear instructions. No matter what, they were to do the job. So on the night to the 19th, so they are ready to go. They're waiting on a suitable weather forecast. There was a Norwegian, a very, very qualified Norwegian meteorologist who was there, and he actually recommended they wait. His view was, given all the information, that they should wait a couple of days. Unfortunately, on the Norwegian side, you had the Grouse Team, and they were looking at the weather, and it had been excellent for almost a week. And the morning of the intended day of the raid, it was also looking good, very similar. And they reported that back and said, it looks okay. I think there was just a concern that if they hung around Skitten 2 more days, then security-wise, there could be issues. And you know, the team on the ground said it's been good and it looks good today. So I think they decided just to go for it. They were delayed in takeoff by about half an hour because the intercom between the gliders and the Halifaxes failed on both combinations, which is not good. And then one of the wing lights on Halifax A also failed, which is bad for the glider trying to position itself above the towing bomber. So they gave Staff Sergeant Strathdy the option to abort after they took off. He was to do a few circuits with the Halifax, and if he felt confident, he would release his undercarriage from the glider, and then they'd be off. And that's exactly what happened. So they set off. They got to combination A. We'll start with them. They got to the coast fine, but then their Rebecca unit seized, and so they were without the guidance system and had to rely on standard navigation. So they do what you would normally do. You use your landmarks and your map reading. They used a lot of lake shapes. And the trouble, as I said earlier, with in November in Norway, the shape of the lake changes because you get a bit of ice forming, and it changes the shape. And also you get this shadow effect of the mountains and lakes. So it made it really hard. And from the official report afterwards, they had a real hard time. They tried for quite a long time to locate the target, but they couldn't. Also, low cloud had come in over the target area, and that's what Combination B must have found, because their Rebecca unit worked. Grouse heard the signal in their Eureka system. They heard the plane fly overhead a couple of times, but the cloud was so thick, low cloud was so thick, that I guess that the pilot of Halifax B Parkinson, he just couldn't bring himself to release a glider into a mountain area with not being able to see where they're going. So both combinations, and of course they had no direct communication with the team on the ground. They didn't have that kind of facility. So both combinations decided to come back and try and get back to the UK. So combination A, they flew through some cloud after about 5-6 hours, and that put moisture onto the tow rope. The tow rope started to ice up. Ice started forming on the plane on the plane as well, and the whole thing was just pulling them down. They were having to use extra fuel to try and regain altitude, and also the glider was getting pulled behind into the slipstream of the Halifax. And the tail gunner Tom Connor, he watched the glider start to bounce around a lot, and then suddenly it just veered off to one side. The tow rope snapped, and it just disappeared into the night. So they circulated a couple of times, and they couldn't see anything. So then they headed back to base and arrived about 1:40 in the morning, and they could report that they'd lost their glider. On the way back, they actually sent a message. They sent a message: glider released in sea, and they released it in an open transmission, which did create a lot of problems because it was supposed to be in code, and it wasn't over the sea. And so why that was said is a little bit hard to say. They're very close to one of the big fjords. Their navigation by that time may have been slightly faulty. Perhaps they did think they were over the sea. We'll never know. But they got back safely, so 7 of them came back. Combination B, we know that it passed over the target zone. Okay, headed back, and it crashed in the southwest of Norway, and we know a little bit about that, but we have almost nothing from them themselves. So the first thing is that Lord Mountbatten has to inform the Prime Minister, because the Prime Minister has been following this mission closely. So he informs them by letter that the mission has failed the next day, and that the ground team or the Grouse Team reported aircraft they heard, but nothing landed. So it was a failure. And Churchill is commenting, well, what do you mean, and how much, and tell me more, and so on and so forth, as you would expect them to do. So that's all they had at that time. But it wasn't just 2 days later, the Germans released a news communique on Reuters, which is picked up by the European press, and including the British press. And it says 2 British bombers, each towing a glider, penetrated in southern Norway on the 19th of November. 1 bomber, both gliders were forced to land. The sabotage troops were engaged and killed to a man, and this really created consternation in the leaders of the mission back in the UK, particularly Lieutenant Colonel Henniker, obviously, and Combined Operations Command. He refused to believe this. He refused to believe there's no operation where everybody is killed like that. There's got to be wounded and captured and so on. And He felt the Germans were on a fishing mission to try and get a response out of the British, and so they put a complete security clamp on information at that particular time. For the air crews, not coming back from a mission, sadly, was something that many people experienced through the war. So their telegrams went out on the 22nd. They received theirs, but just after that, you had the last letters starting to appear in the letterboxes of the engineers and the glider pilots' families. And then it wasn't until the 3rd of December that the official missing telegrams were sent to them. So they kept it quiet for a couple of weeks until they could figure out what to do. But then they started sending it officially. So that must have been a horrendous time for the families.
Mm.
So we'll come to combination glider 8 in a little bit, but I want to, because it's a slightly longer story, but combination B, this is the kind of area you're looking at. And I wanted this view because you can see how close they actually were to the coast, the Norwegian coast. But this view, this is looking towards the UK. The Halifax B Crash site down in the bottom left there, it's called a mountain, but it's only 400 meters. So that plane crashed. When it crashed, it was incredibly low when it hit that mountain. And the glider crashed on the other side of the valley around about the same time. And the lensman's house near the glider crash site, I'll come back to that in a minute, and Sletterbø camp and the burial site we'll come to. But I just wanted to show how close they actually were to the coast, which might explain what actually happened. So locals heard a British bomber aircraft flying around, circling around about just before midnight. They knew it was British because they recognized the sound of the engines, very different from German aero engines. So by that stage of the war, the locals were very well aware if it was British or German. And it flew around, circled a couple of times, getting lower and lower. And then the last time it flew right over a farmhouse to the extent that the farmer ran outside and you could see the plane flying overhead. And then it disappeared over a low rise, and then there was this massive explosion. So this is around about midnight on the 19th. So he got a friend and neighbor close by. They took their paraffin lamps and they made their way up in the direction of where they'd seen the flash, and they found just a massive wreckage all over the mountainside. And they found the tail gunner more or less intact, and they found 5 more bodies in the wreckage. But everybody was dead, and there was nothing they could do. So they went back, reported it the next morning to the Norwegian authorities. The sheriff and the lensman Hovland, he contacted the German authorities in Egersund, which is only a few miles away. They sent a detachment up there to take over the site. A few days after that, a 7th body was found in the rocks on the mountainside, and they were initially buried very badly in a shallow grave. They just scraped the moss and the earth off the bedrock and threw all the bodies in there and just covered it up. And they put this sign which basically says, "Here lie the bodies of the aircrew of a sabotage aircraft." From what I hear, it was a bright yellow sign, and Norwegian locals hated this. They used to go up there and put flowers on the grave, and eventually one of them just took it and threw it away. They were eventually moved to a better burial site, and after the war, they were taken to Helleland and buried properly. But 2 of the jackets survived, one in the Royal Engineers Museum and one in Dalen the Folk Museum, and they belonged to Flight Lieutenant Thomas, the navigator, and the pilot, Roland Parkinson, and they flew together a long time even before this mission, and they're pictured, the 2 men on the left at the lower left there. That's them wearing probably the same jackets, and the one in the middle is the farmer that picked it up. So the glider, it also crashed around midnight on the other side of the valley. 3 men were killed, both pilots, the Australians, and driver Ernest Pendlebury. Around 2 in the morning, 2 soldiers appeared at the lensman's house, the sheriff's house. They'd already been through 2 other farms. They'd gone straight down the hill to the first farmhouse, and they actually went into somebody's farm, but he didn't speak English and he was a bit scared about who they were. But he directed them towards the sheriff's house. So they went there, and after some discussion, they said, "Look, we've got a number of men seriously injured up on the hillside. We need medical help." It's the middle of the night. The Germans are monitoring telephones, so if you're phoning up for a doctor at 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning, there's a possibility it's going to be intercepted. And so after a discussion, they decided to contact the German army garrison nearby in Sletterbø, near Egersund, not the security forces, not the German security forces, but the army garrison, and assuming they'd be taken prisoners of war. They were all in their uniforms. And so the Germans arrived around about 3:30 with a translator, and they and a group of Norwegian volunteers hiked up to the crash site. They got a bit lost on the way. The Germans, the Norwegians were a bit faster, and they got there about 15 minutes before, and were able to talk to Lieutenant Allen and the 14 other, or the 13 other survivors. They put all their armaments to one side and their explosives to one side, and most of them were sleeping in their sleeping bags, just waiting to be taken prisoner. They'd realized that there was no way out. They asked where Sweden was, and when they were told they were on the other side of Norway and it's winter, there was no opportunity to make their original escape plan. So they seemed to have accepted they were going to be POWs. So by 10:30 that morning, all 14 were at Hovland Farm awaiting transport, and the local army work service camp, young youths, they remember the guys playing around this house. That's the Lensman's house in the bottom left hand. They were playing in the garden and just mucking around like young guys do who have just survived a 5-6 hour flight in a glider and a crash landing, and they're still alive and must have felt pretty good. So they were taken a few miles to the German army camp at Schlettebe. They were interrogated. They were photographed. Unfortunately, we don't have any of that material, but they were. It was destroyed by the Germans after the war, at the end of the war. But they were interrogated and photographed. The 280th Infantry Division Adjutant, Colonel Probst, he, for some reason, decided that the Commando Befehl should be applied in this particular case. The Commando Befehl had only come out a few weeks before, and it's possible that not everyone was entirely sure of, because they didn't have it written in front of them. It's not something they could, it was something they were told by their senior commanders, and nobody actually carried around a copy of this because that was strictly forbidden. The security police were informed in Stavanger. They sent 2 people down. They were adamant that they should be handed over to the Gestapo or the security services. But Probst, he claimed that they were army business, and that his job was to have them executed. And so around about 4 o'clock, they ordered all the Norwegian workers to leave the camp. Some of them they missed, and that was good because we had their witness testimony after the war. But most of them were ordered out around 4 p.m. And then soldiers were taken out of the hospital, which is where they'd been kept to this time. And they were led, flanked by 2 German soldiers, about 50 meters apart, towards a secluded area up in the where these ammunition sheds were along that path. It would have looked a bit like that because there was a little bit of snow, but not it wasn't covered in snow. And they were led to an area just behind one of the ammunition sheds. A firing squad was in that shed, and when each man was brought forward, they stripped his uniform, tunic off, and then he was put in front of a rock, or put in front of that area there, and executed. Then his body was dragged away to a shallow grave nearby, and then the next man was brought in. It took between 1.5 to 2 hours to do this, and you can imagine what it was like for these young guys who were already injured and had survived. And from the first volley, they would have probably guessed exactly what was going on. And you also had a bunch of German soldiers sitting along the way, watching them doing it, and there were a group looking over the execution site and watching this happen. And they gave testimony after the war. So absolutely gruesome thing to happen. The bodies were picked up that evening by Polish prisoners of war and driven to near a minefield in the sand dunes of Brusand and buried there. Luckily, a local Norwegian observed them doing this and marked the spot so they could lead authorities to that after the war. So back to Glider A. So Glider A, its tug go back to Scotland, but they broke free, and so they circled around for a bit trying to find a suitable landing site. But the weather was pretty bad by this stage. It was sleet showers, and so they ended up in this bowl-shaped valley in Fyljestalen, and they crashed very heavily at a high angle straight into the mountain, and 8 of them were killed. Pretty much straight away. 2 survived a little bit longer from some of the interrogation reports we have, but 8 people were killed anyway. So in the morning, the survivors walked to that farm, and then they were taken further down into the valley to get help. So 3 survivors, and by process elimination, it worked out that it's Cairncross and Jackson and Bonner that made their way to the house. They stood under that tree. My wife and I were up there actually on Saturday, last Saturday, but they stood underneath that tree, and the locals who lived there, they looked out and could see these guys. It was obviously a bit concerning. Waited for them to come in, but they wouldn't. So Torvald Filiusdal, he went out and talked to them and brought them in for some hot drinks. He couldn't speak any English, and he couldn't understand what they wanted, but he understood they were in a plane crash. They were able to make those kind of noises, and also they kept repeating doctor. They needed a doctor, so he agreed to take them down to the nearest telephone, which was like a 2.5 hour hike down the mountainside. I've done that hike, and it's not easy in the summer, and in the winter it would have been pretty awful. One of the questions that I have in my own mind is, so Corporal Cairncross, he was the highest surviving NCO, and why did he go and leave the other ones in the crash? But I guess he was hoping and assuming that the telephone would be nearby, and they would go and report, and then they could go back. But after 2.5 hours down the mountain, there's no way they're going back up there. So they went down. They called the local sheriff, who was that lady up, acting sheriff at the time, Hjördis Espedal, and her brother, Leif Espedal, next to her. He was also at the sheriff's office. She dispatched him and the local doctor to the area to find out what was going on. She contacted her bosses in Stavanger, the police department in Stavanger. The local police chief was a Quisling and NS member, and he informed the German security services. They basically said, okay, you've got 3 guys there from a plane. Can you send 2 of your officers to the area to pick them up, bring them in for questioning? We'll find out what happened. And that's what they did. So those 2 police officers there, Raden Tolson and Knut Leirevåg, they set off to the area. And then they met the 3 soldiers down at a place called Hoheller, where the phone was. Once they talked to them, they realized, okay, this is way bigger than a small plane crash. There's multiple people up there. They're soldiers. They're no airmen. And so Knut Leirevåg had to make a report to his boss, telling him this. Then the Gestapo were informed by the police chief, and they warned Knut that if he let anything happen to those 3 prisoners before they got there, then he would pay for it with his life. So he spent a pretty uncomfortable night. Raden Tolson and the Espedals, they went up the mountain with a local guide to see what they could do to help. So the Germans arrived next day. They picked up the 3 men who had already arrived by the fjord. They went along the coast. They picked up 2 more that had been brought down on stretchers, and put 5 of them on board an air sea rescue launch, which is the one down in the bottom left there. And interestingly, that's the one that General Thorne purloined at the end of the war, if you like, or took over and renamed it Pegasus. So that's the very boat. Right. Back up on the mountain, the Raden Tolson, the policeman, he made a note, as we do, of everybody that was there, and he was given assistance by the survivors, and he Sapper White, who's pictured there, and he wrote the names of who was there. And really interesting, this, because it was like partly nicknames, partly people they knew well and not so well, equipment that they found, and particularly the armaments. He was very careful to note how many rifles and Sten guns and so on, because he knew the Germans would be very keen on that. But there's a comment there that and 2 glider pilots don't know their names. So the soldiers didn't know the names of the glider pilots. They'd never met them before the night of the mission. They trained completely separately, and they didn't know their names, which I just find it incredible. But that's a fact. So the Germans went up there. They burst into the farmhouse. All the soldiers were there by that time, and but some of them very severely injured, broken hips and fractured skulls and so on. But the locals were looking after them as best they could. The Gestapo rushed in and started kicking people around, as they love to do, My friend, his grandmother was there at the time, and she remembers the screams and said she never forgot that her entire life of the treatment they got. Luckily, they had a very courageous young Norwegian medical student, Johan Frederick II, and he demanded they stop that kind of treatment, and they did, and there was no further mistreatment of the men. So then they took everybody back down the mountain after a couple of days, and then the 8 dead were buried locally by the locals close to the crash site, without that pair of boots. That's a very nice pair of boots that was used by the local farmer for about 20-30 years, and you can imagine they had very little in those days. It was their land, all this had happened. Yeah. Their house had been trashed by everything going on. They'd had a detachment of Gestapo and 30 Wehrmacht troops staying in their house, and you're burying these people, and it's a very nice pair of boots. So anyway, they took those and kept them. And after the war, when they recovered the bodies, the officer made a note saying Staff Sergeant Strathdee, no boots. So I'm guessing they may well be Strathdee's boots. Mm. So all survivors were transported back by boat to Stavanger. They were imprisoned in this place here, which still exists. Not a prison anymore, of course, but it was the Gestapo prison. They were held in separate. The 5 severely injured were held in separate cells. They received no medical treatment at all, despite multiple fractures and concussion and goodness knows what else. They were given a cursory examination by a Luftwaffe doctor, who we'll come back to in a minute. And he unbandaged them and bandaged them again, just so he could record what injuries they had, but they were given no treatment whatsoever. Stuck in 2 cells and left there until the Gestapo from Oslo could send one of their senior officers, case officers, to the area. The Army and Air Force made no attempt to do anything this time because of all the noise they got from the Slettebø incident. So this was very much a security services show from this point on. Kriminalsekretær Herbert Ster arrived from the Oslo Gestapo, and a Norwegian SOE agent, Ernst Kirkeby Jacobsen. You can't make this stuff up. He had been inserted into Norway earlier that year, and he had been captured and had managed to persuade the Germans that he was willing to work as a double agent. He'd actually been allowed to go and live with his wife in Oslo. And they brought him for this interrogation, I guess, to try and determine whether any of the men, who were all talking English, obviously, but to see if any were actually Norwegians, if they were Norwegian agents. Luckily, they did take him because he was able to give us a very, very detailed description of their condition and interrogation when he escaped early the next year back to the UK. So he gave a full debrief and was able to say a lot about what went on there. After the interrogation was done, the 5 soldiers were selected for further interrogation, and they were taken out of the prison and taken to Oslo, to Greeni prison camp, which is where most of the Norwegian resistance people were held. And then the 4 remaining soldiers were actually murdered by the Gestapo in Stavanger. It's a horrible story, and I'm not going to dwell on it tonight. But you had a Luftwaffe doctor, a guy called Seeling, who had come in contact with the Gestapo earlier because he was helping them try to understand an outbreak of venereal disease within the security services in Stavanger. And so he got quite pally with the Gestapo hierarchy at the time. He had a surgery quite close to their headquarters. And the head of the Gestapo or security services in Stavanger ordered his men to shoot the 4 remaining guys. And they refused to do it. This is true, they actually refused to do it because they said they're all broken in pieces, they're lying on stretchers, and we're not doing it. So Seeling, he popped up and said, well, I could inject him with morphine. And that could, his claim after in his trial was that his idea was just to knock them out so then they could be shot and they wouldn't suffer. Ridiculous idea, yeah. So they went along with this, and he administered multiple doses of morphine and one soldier succumbed, 2 others didn't, and they were variously strangled and mistreated until they did die. The 4th miraculously just refused to give up, and the next day they picked him up, took him to the Gestapo headquarters, and told him to go down the stairs to the cells. As he walked down the stairs, a Gestapo driver shot him in the back of the head in the building, and then another Gestapo officer fired a second shot into him. The guys were stripped of the uniforms, put in their sleeping bags, wrapped with cords and stones, and dumped at sea off the island of Kritsøy, off Stavanger. So their bodies have never been recovered, and there's a memorial particularly to them in the cemetery in Stavanger. They were never recovered. So the 5 survivors, they were taken to Greeni. The Germans are very good at keeping records, and luckily this one survived. It wasn't destroyed. But it's the prison register for the Greeni prison camp, and you can see when they came in, what day they came in, what time they were signed in. They were classified as Sunder, which means special, so they're put in the high security block that you see down on the bottom left. And we know that they were interrogated several times, but they were never tortured. And we know that because they were in communication with the Norwegians, other Norwegian prisoners. We know that although they were in isolation and they were never allowed to meet, Norwegians being Norwegians and very clever at finding ways around difficulties, they discovered that you could talk to each other through the ventilation shafts. There's a ventilation vent in each cell, and if you lie down and speak through it, you can talk to everybody in the cell block, which they did continuously during their imprisonment. They were held in 2 separate cells and then moved into one on Christmas Eve in 1942, and they were given better treatment, they were given better food, they were given reading materials, and they were given tobacco, which most of these things were absolutely not standard for the Norwegian prisoners, who were treated pretty badly. They shared it with the Norwegian prisoners. How did you do that? They tied it in a bag and hung it out their cell window down to the cell below. And we know this because after the war, the guy in the cell sent them a letter thanking them for the gift of cheese and tobacco on Christmas Eve.
Wow.
Just incredible. And that's one of the letters there. So I have several of these letters that were sent by the Norwegian prisoners after the war. So on the 18th of January 1943, for whatever reason, the Germans decided that enough was enough, and they had no further use for these 5 guys. They didn't want to send them to a prisoner of war camp, despite the fact they were told they were going to a prisoner of war camp. One of the other prisoners had talked to them before they left and said they were due to be taken to a camp. The guy who supervised the executions for the security services in Norway or in Oslo was Oscar Hans. He's very well known in Norway. He was instructed by his boss, Heinrich Felis, to execute the prisoners. So then he immediately ordered a detail from the Gestapo headquarters or SD headquarters in Oslo to go to Trandum Wood, which is where they did a lot of their executions, and to dig a grave that afternoon, which they did. The next morning at about 4:20, they were taken out of the camp, put into a couple of trucks, and driven under escort to Trandum Wood. This is January, so there you have really thick snow. The lorries had quite a lot of trouble getting there. They were dressed in their woolly clothes. We know this because that's how they were found after the war. But they were also given German greatcoats with fur collars to keep them warm on the way. Interesting kindness just before you're going to shoot somebody. They were told that they were going for a meeting with German senior command who wanted to ask them questions about glider equipment and things they had with them. So they were told they would have to be blindfolded because they were going through a secure area, and they'd be taken to the meeting. And when they were told to stand to attention, that they would be told to stand to attention when the German officers arrived. When they got there, super early in the morning, it was freezing cold, really thick snow. And Oscar Hans was a very efficient kind of guy. He went to have a look at the grave, and the grave wasn't big enough. It wasn't deep enough, and it wasn't wide enough, according to him. So he took a detachment from the guards that he had with him and made them dig it. So they spent another hour making the grave bigger. So these soldiers are sitting in this freezing cold lorry with their German greatcoats, waiting for this meeting, and they must have had a very bad feeling about this. I guess they must have done. So anyway, they're taken out of the trucks eventually. The greatcoats are taken off them, and they're marched through thick snow to the grave. Then they're lined up in the grave. The 5 freshman soldiers and a British sailor, Bob Evans, who was captured following Operation Title, the mini submarine attack on the Tirpitz. He seemed to be brought in as a job lot of executions of British people at this time. So sadly, he was also brought in, and so Oscar Hans gave the order to come to attention. The firing squad were already there, 18 of them. They'd already loaded and their rifles, so no sign was made. And as soon as the call to attention was made, then they fired, and the bodies fell into the grave. They buried them, removed all the cartridge cases and all traces of the execution, and that was that. So obviously, it's a big deal to find out what happened to these guys after the war. There was a lot of intelligence coming across to the UK from escaping Norwegians and from SOE and from the Shetland bus people and from Sweden and being flown over. So there was a lot of information. Nothing of this was given to the families, of course. They knew nothing. They put pressure on the Red Cross, the Red Cross put pressure on the German authorities, asking where are the missing 41, and at some point they released a number of names and said they'd been in a glider and crashed in the sea and were dead. They were a mixture of people from both gliders, so why they picked these names, no idea, but it had a consequence because it meant that they were then officially dead and their wives lost their servicemen's pay. They went straight on to widows' pensions. Right. But there's no reason why they picked that number. It's very hard to say. Then you had the post-war investigations. You had to have an agreement with the authorities, the Norwegian, how you're going to do this. You had to screen, and there were more than 300,000 fully armed Germans in Norway at the time. You had to get rid of these without getting rid of any of the bad boys, so to speak, who were very good at putting on German Army and Air Force uniforms and hiding amongst the normal troops. They had screening services where they had to pass through groups of people that used to work with them and point them out, and segregate the people. The interest. You had this registry. The paperwork was enormous to register. 400,000 people ultimately were being registered, plus all the Russian and other prisoners of war. It's enormous exercise, but they got through it. They originally started with the Public Safety and Welfare Branch in the Civil Affairs Division. That was the first phase of the War Crimes Investigation. Then that went on to the War Crimes Investigation Branch, and then you had the trials. So the first lot was the phase 1, the public safety officers, all ex-policemen brought in to help. You also had the commanding officer of 261 Field Park Company, one of the units was involved, Major Chivers. He was tireless in trying to find out what happened and gathering intelligence. So he used his liaison officers to find out as much as he could. Initially, you had mostly focus on Stavanger because a lot of it happened in that area, southwest of Stavanger. You had Major Neil Martin, who was the Special Forces liaison with the Milorg district commander. They did quite a lot. And then you had Major Frank Rawlings, another policeman. He was brought in afterwards and to take over the investigation. The takeover was quite interesting, purely because of this letter that Martin wrote. I always like to show this one. By this time, they'd already realized who was mostly to blame for the Schletterberg executions by the German army. And this is Martin's handover letter saying, "Dear Rawlings, here's my papers. This is what I found out so far. If you need anything else, just let me know." And at the end, he says, "I do hope you have enough to hang that bastard Probst." And also note the paper. It's they pinched it from the Gestapo offices in Stavanger. So they'd obviously gone in there and nicked everything they could from there, and so they used their paper as well. So Frank Rawlings, he came in and he worked with the local police, Herman Rowland, and they put out an article in local newspapers. An eyewitness came forward, Christopher Varden. He's the guy who saw the Germans burying the 14, or actually all 17 bodies at Bruceland. He was able to point them out, and so after quite a lot of digging, actually, because the sand dunes had moved, they did find the bodies. They were taken back to Sletterba, ironically, to be examined by the forensic pathologist, and then they were reburied with full honours in Eiganes. Phase 2, because the scale of the war crimes was just way beyond anything the public safety officers could handle, they formed a new branch, 36 officers, 20 ORs, within 48 hours, and flew them out to Norway in July. Established their headquarters in Oslo with 6 teams assigned to the different regions, and some of the PSOs, the policemen, remained in place to help them, but the rest of the people were handled by them. Hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of interrogations and statements and so on. It's amazing. At the end of 1945, everything moved to Germany, to the British area of occupation. So there were 3 cases identified eventually. Case one was the killing of the 4 British soldiers, the murder in Stavanger by the security services, the 14 who were executed by the German army at Sletterba, and the 5 British soldiers and 1 sailor at Trandonwood in the following year. Out of that, 5 trials came up. The first of those, they only got Sealing, the doctor. They got Eric Hoffman, the driver, who had shot the guy going down the stairs, and he fully admitted it. And one of the jailers, Fritz Fairline, who was an evil son of a bitch. He freely admitted killing some Russian prisoners of war. Incredible. Sealing was executed by firing squad in Norway. Hoffman was sentenced to be hanged, but Norway doesn't allow hanging. So they took him to Germany and hanged him in Germany instead. And Fritz Fairline got 20 years imprisonment, but he was released early. Unbelievable. No idea how that could happen. But there was at least 4 or 5 others who were involved that were never traced or were dead. The head of Gestapo in Stavanger, for example, he was killed just before the end of the war.
Just another quick question for you, Bruce, about the trials, because we've got our whole big war crimes series coming up in September and indeed in October. Were some of these individuals, were they tried for multiple different crimes across Norway and other, or was it just these particular cases? Because across the board, that was one of the failings of the war crimes trials. They tended to not use kind of circumstantial evidence of other crimes. They would just try them for one specific one, and then sometimes they ended up that they got very light sentences. So because people like some of these sons of bitches you've been talking about, they don't just do one thing. They're repeat offenders, aren't they?
Yeah, absolutely. No, that's a fabulous question, and an entire presentation on war crimes trials. But to answer that,
here's my formal invitation to come back and do a war crimes round.
Here's specifically only the head of the German forces in Norway, Falkenhorst, was tried for multiple instances. The others, it was very specific. Although Oscar Hans in trial 5. He was tried by the Norwegians first and sentenced to death, and then he was acquitted because under Norwegian law, they couldn't prove that he wasn't given written orders by his superior officer and that the people that he was executing hadn't been given a proper trial and had been found guilty of resistance crimes, so to speak. And so they released him and handed him over to the British, who immediately tried him as well and sentenced him to death, and then commuted it to 20 years imprisonment. And the same with the members of the firing squad in the Gestapo firing squad. They prosecuted 13. They found 9 of them guilty, gave them 15-year sentences. But all of these guys were out in the early 50s. They were all released in the early 1950s. So the only executions that were carried out were Sealing and Hoffman, And because that was the first trial, it was the only one that was in Norway. The rest were all done in Germany afterwards. And if you were tried early, the sentence would tend to be much more severe than 2 or 3 years afterwards. People were getting tired of the whole process, and so a lot of them escaped justice. To be honest, they did. But Falkenhorst, he was generally accused of facilitating this whole thing, and by ordering his men to hand over saboteurs to the security services as per the Commando Befehl, and that's really what pinned him. But again, he was the same. He was also released in the 50s and on medical grounds, and lived for another 15 years, whatever. So justice, I don't know. So summary. So the first casualties, if you like, were the Mosquito crew, the reconnaissance crew, who were trying to take pictures of the glider landing site. They were killed on the 17th of October. Just over 4 weeks later, the Operation Refreshment set off. There were 48 men. Only 7 returned after that mission. 24 hours after that, only 9 of the 41 who crash landed were still alive, and 1 week later, there was only 5. And then 51 days after that, the last 5 were executed by the Gestapo. None of them who took part in Freshman ever received any gallantry awards. And of the 7 aircrew who returned to Skitten, Squadron Leader Wilkinson, he was killed in the invasion of Sicily, shot down possibly by friendly fire. And the air commander, Group Captain Cooper, was killed in 1949 flying on a test flight with a Gloucester Meteor. So that was the men of Operation Freshman, and I was finished with that one. That's the youngest guy who took part. He was 18 years old, Sapper Gerald Williams. So we have to remember these guys were young men. The oldest was in his early 30s. Some of them married with children, and all the way down to 18. So it was a tough operation. Lots of brave young men, and they deserve to be better remembered than they are. So thank you.
Well, thank you. And one of the, we talked about at the beginning about memorialization, and we were talking before going live about the fact there are more museums, more informational plaques. There's information out there. So in the time you've been doing that must be gratifying to realize that there is increased interest in this story all these years later.
Yeah, absolutely. It's phenomenal. I added one slide. Don't worry, anybody who's watching, there's not another 10. but we have a program now of unveiling new information boards at the different crash sites, execution sites, and prison sites, and so on and so forth. The local councils have been absolutely outstanding, making new walkways and renovating different sites. The freshman families have contributed to the cost of some of the new information boards. So the real effort to create what would be the freshman trail, so that visitors who want to come across can follow the whole thing. And we've had multiple memorial services with on the 80th anniversary, we had almost 36 family members over to Norway for 8 days. I took them to all the sites, and we ended up at the British Embassy in Oslo for a reception, which was fabulous. So there's a lot of things that we're still trying to do, and hopefully have a new museum in the Gestapo prison in Stavanger. So we're working on a plan to try and make that happen right now.
Brilliant stuff. Well, we've got a couple of questions for you. A lot of them you kind of addressed as we went along. Well, firstly, Gina wants us to give a shout out to the Glider Pilot Regiments Society. I will put the link in there because there's more engineers involved in this, and as you said, they're glider pilots and also the Norwegian elements. So there's multiple facets of this. So I've done that for you there, Gina. Gary asked about the tow ropes. Were the tow ropes dry treated, or could it not be done because they were hemp?
It's a great question. I don't actually know the answer to that one, but I'm going to find out.
Now Gary comes in with some good questions every now and then.
That's a cracking question. Unfortunately, we don't have any of the original rope left, which is a shame, because it was found two sets or two pieces of substantial pieces of the rope were found. The tow rope were found at 2 different sites, but they were used by the local farmers and eventually, I guess, disintegrated. But they did exist, and they were used for a long time afterwards.
But this is the point you made about this being, the first glider operation, because there are lessons being learned in North Africa, Tunisia, Operation Husky. You mentioned the Eureka set. This is before it had even got close to being a routine, and you could still argue that even 2 years later, they hadn't quite cracked the principle of gliders. So, of course, things were not corners were cut, but just it was learning as you went along. The doctrine had not been written yet. That's the thing.
Absolutely.
Gary also asked about, has there been any finalized developments for the memorial at Skitton Airfield?
There has. So the memorial at Skitton Airfield was rededicated earlier this year. So there's the new plaque has been carved, funded by the Royal British Legion Wick branch. Right. I had a picture of it on that. We had a group of relatives up there, and some amazing pictures of them standing on the tarmac, what's left of the tarmac at Skitton. So the memorial there has been completely refurbished, redone, with a corrected and newly engraved plaque at Skitton.
And someone's asking about how you can find this information out about visiting the sites in Norway. So if you've got some links for me, Bruce, I can add them to the description later on, because I'm assuming there are various sort of tourist board and information things online that one can search to find these routes.
A little bit, yeah. And there's some on the council sites that I've been working with. But I mean, if they just send me an email, I will send you maps and everything. So,
okay. Yeah. So my question of you really is, obviously you have got, to say this has become a personal story for you is an understatement. You must feel like these young men as almost family members. Yeah. And we talked about the fact it obviously didn't work, but it was followed up by the missions that did work, and we talked about the denying of the Germans the atomic capability that we now know, and it's been the sidebar. The Germans were nowhere near where the Allies thought they were. So. I often use the analogy of having an emotional hat and an analytical hat. Obviously, we now know that, but they didn't know it then. So have you kind of rectified yourself whether this was quote unquote worth it?
Yeah, no, it's as we were talking earlier, that the hindsight is just the most wonderful thing when you actually know these things. But you knew. What you did know was that the Germans had some very, very capable scientists. Some of them were key in key physicists and chemists. So they knew what you had to do. They did make some errors in calculations that perhaps slowed them down. They weren't given the full backing of people and finances, because Germany they were focusing on other types of weapons, and there was a lot of the need for their skills in other developments. And if you look at what the Americans did, how many people they put into the Manhattan Project and how much money they pumped into it. I mean, Germany was never going to come close to that. But you just didn't know at the time. You knew they had capable people, and you knew that they wanted heavy water, and the Allies could only think that, well, are they a bit further ahead than we recognize, or not? And could you take the risk? And
it's a silly gamble to not do. If you go, oh no, we thought that, we didn't think that, it's a risk worth taking. Despite the tragedy of the outcome of this, in global terms, a few dozen men killed. When there's someone pointed out, this is the same time as the encirclement of Stalingrad happening, when it's literally hundreds of thousands. So. It's never a risk worth taking if it's your son, of course, who gets killed. But on a global level, I suppose it is. And the other thing I think that came up in the sidebar as well is when you add this with all the other operations, we had Fruder on last week, we're talking about Operation Title tomorrow, is that there was a lot of attention the Allies put on Norway, resistance activities up and down the country, which contributes to the fact that there were 300,000 Germans still there in 1944. So that's a secondary reason beyond the actual definitive, let's knock out the heavy water plant. But it does mean that Norway is a place that Hitler gets a bit paranoid about, in a kind of a Channel Island kind of way, doesn't he? So that you've got to take into consideration, even though that wasn't the primary the primary.
Oh, yeah, absolutely right. Hitler was absolutely obsessed with Norway, for many reasons. Culturally as well. He had this thing about Norway, and the Atlantic Wall, and just that whole concept of fortifying Norway, thinking it was going to be an entry point in later in the war. So he was totally obsessed by it, and the Allies were clever at keeping that kind of anxiety going, because as you say, locking up so many troops in a country that really from quite early on in the war was never going to be an entry point for the Allies afterwards. So they managed to successfully lock up all these troops there and all these resources and submarines and aircraft. It was a task well done, a good intelligence task well done.
Well, we'll end this with the as Bruce said earlier on. If anyone ends up watching this either in the near future or sometime in the distant future on YouTube, and you have information about one of these soldiers or some aspect of it that Bruce has not yet found, well, that's your chance to get in touch either via the channel or find Bruce's contact details himself and pass it. One of the great gratifying things about this is that people have been in touch with guest historians with extra information, because there's always that extra piece of the puzzle to find. So that would be great if something comes as a direct result of this. But in the meantime, it's been absolutely extraordinary. I was looking forward to this one, despite the tragic ending, because the detail has been extraordinary. So thank you very much, Bruce. Thank you very much for your fantastic questions. We're off to the Operation Title tomorrow with so we're talking about the Tirpitz tomorrow, and then Friday we have the rescue of Denmark's Jewish population, which I'm also looking forward to. So thanks as always. Click like and subscribe, buy my guests' books, visit their websites, go to their blogs, etc., so they carry on doing more research. This is Paul Woodadge for World War II TV saying enjoy the rest of your Wednesday. Cheers, everybody. Bye.